So this is our now third installment of Russia and Race, which is moving along faster than I thought it would. We're in October. Today is October. This is October. It is Thursday, October 1st, for those of you who want to know what day of the week it is and aren't always sure. It was a little joke, but thank you so much for joining us. I see we've got about 40 participants on the Zoom chat, on the Zoom call. As we've done in the past, we take questions at the end via chat. I'll read them out loud to the speaker, and we've been able to entertain questions this way in the past. I am very excited that we have here today Professor Ann Lounsbery, who is department chair and professor of Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. Professor Lounsbery has a BA from Brown and a PhD from Harvard. Her research has received NEH funding. Her first book was Thin Culture and High Art, Gogol, Hawthorne, and Authorship in 19th Century Russia and America. And that came out with Harvard University Press. And more recently, her book, Life is Elsewhere, Symbolic Geography in the Russian Provinces, 1800 to 1917, came out with Cornell University Press. And if you have any interest in 19th century Russian literature, you should go get it, because this book is fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Covers so much ground that is so as a normal cover. So anyway, without further ado, Anne is going to be talking. The title of her talk today. Hold on. This is the internet. Lets us down once in a while, not always. I'm very excited to have Anne talking here today and sort of, shifting gears a little bit on the kinds of subjects we've had so far. We've had some really wonderful speakers. So the title of her presentation today is very relevant, on teaching American students how race works in Russia. And so I think without further ado, Professor Ann Lounsbery.
Thank you so much, Annie, for inviting me. This has been a really wonderful speaker series, and thank you to everybody who's made time to be here, because I know it's an incredibly busy moment of the semester. So I want to start out by emphasizing that my focus today is not how race works in Russia, because there are other speakers in this series who are better qualified to address that question. I'm going to talk about my experiences teaching this topic to American students and what I've learned from those experiences. So I think it would be helpful for that reason if I start out with a little bit of backstory. My graduate degree is in comparative literature. And besides Russian, which was my main field, and Polish, I also studied American literature. And one of my teachers and recommendation writers was Henry Louis Gates. And I was by no means training to be a specialist in the African American tradition, but Gates was just extraordinarily generous to young scholars, and he was interested enough in the Russian American comparative angle to take me on. So in 1999, when I was writing my dissertation on Gogol and Hawthorne, Gates at that time was writing the foreword to a volume on Pushkin and Blackness that was being put together by Kathy Nepomniachtchi, Nicole Svobodny, and Lyudmila Trigos. So this is what would turn out to be that pioneering collection published in 2005, Under the Sky of My Africa. And some of you may know that essays in that collection. And they were putting it together, and the editors needed a contribution on the African-American reception of Pushkin. So Gates, along with, I believe, Bill Todd, suggested me, and that was it. And I said yes. And what that meant was I had to educate myself very, very quickly, in a panic, basically, on the conditions under which Pushkin's American reception took shape. And then I had to research the reception itself. So what that meant in effectively pre-internet 1999 was many sweaty months in the stacks of Widener Library, looking through all the issues of every African-American periodical I could find. just sitting on the floor in the stocks and looking through, and looking in the ones that were indexed, looking in the index volumes and things like that. So it also meant, of course, reading frantically to try to get up to speed on the burgeoning scholarship in both African American literature and critical race theory. Although I'm not sure that in 1999 we were yet using the designation critical race theory. And I am eternally grateful that this opportunity fell into my lap. Now, of course, it was useful to me professionally as a young academic, especially when the article was translated into Russian and came out in NLO, because at that time, the idea of taking Pushkin's Blackness seriously was still new to Russians and striking to them. But for me personally, much more significant was that the experience of researching Pushkin's reception was intellectually transformative. Reading through the myriad ingenious ways that African American thinkers had made both sense and use of Pushkin was a whole education. It was an education in the bizarre vagaries of racial categorization systems. And of course, Black Americans had been pointing out the insanity of these systems long before white Americans were willing to listen. It was also an education in how meanings and categories travel. And in doing so, they're transformed, sometimes transformed beyond recognition, sometimes not beyond recognition. So just to kind of recreate my experience in discovering this, I'm going to give you just one example that blew my mind when I was in the stocks in Widener looking through these publications. So it did not surprise me that many Black American writers emphasized the importance of Pushkin's serf nanny, Arina Rodionovna, to whom Pushkin famously attributed his knowledge of Russian folk culture. And here, if I can share my screen, I'm going to show you a picture of Arina Rodionovna from the time of the 1937 Pushkin Jubilee, which, as you know, was celebrated on a massive scale by the Soviets in 1937. In the middle of the terror, they had a big Pushkin celebration, and Arina Rodionovna figured prominently. So it says up there that it's the Jubilee 1837, 1937. Okay, just a sec. So it didn't surprise me that the figure of Arina Rodionovna was of interest to Black American writers. But what did strike me was how, in many of the texts I encountered, Arina Rodionovna, in effect, became Black, at times quite explicitly so. For example, J.A. Rogers, who was an author, journalist, and historian writing in the earlier decades of the 20th century, he called her Pushkin's mammy, and he specifically used the word mammy. So in African-American accounts of the poet's life, what you might call Arina Rodionovna's figurative or structural Blackness allowed her, a Russian serf woman, to do a specific kind of cultural work for Black Americans. That is, she was able to stand in for the rural, poor, maternal Black woman whom Harlan Renaissance intellectuals and others had already identified as the repository of a very powerful oral tradition. So Arina Rodionovna's role in Pushkin's life served to affirm Black artists' efforts both to mine and to transcend this authenticating and maternal culture of the common people, whether it was African Americans in the South for someone like W. Du Bois, or the Narod in Russia, right? And this was going to allow them to do, as Harlem Renaissance writer Alan Locke said, they were going to develop the maturing speech of full racial utterance. And in order to do so, they felt that they needed to be grounded in some sort of organic / folk culture. So Arina Rodionovna was very useful to Black American writers in that way. So this is just one example of the kind of crossing over that led me to start thinking more about race and categories of race. And then it led me to develop a course on the literatures of serfdom and slavery. which I first taught as a postdoc or maybe still in graduate school at Harvard. And I still teach it occasionally. And it's evolved a lot over the years, of course, although I do tend to maintain a focus on the 19th century, since that's my period of specialization. So I've kept thinking about the topic, and I've tried to keep up with developments in critical race theory as best I can, and in the historiography of slavery and serfdom, which is massive, obviously. Now, this class is not easy to teach, not only because it's delicate, although yes, white students will say weird, uncomfortable, sometimes offensive things, and then you have to deal with that. But it's also difficult to teach because, well, I find it intellectually destabilizing for me, myself. And I would say that the hardest thing about teaching this class, is that I'm constantly trying to negotiate between sameness and difference. So that is, I'm constantly trying to figure out when I should emphasize parallels between these two systems and social imaginaries, serfdom and slavery, and when I should emphasize differences, because both approaches can be productive. Both can also be falsifying and misleading. So there's this kind of strain built into the course, right? I'm always kind of deciding, I'm nervous about overemphasizing one way. And I was reminded of this dilemma not long ago, because I was reading the contentious responses to Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And you've probably read some reviews of this book. What Wilkerson is doing is she's trying to see white supremacy and American racial hierarchies more clearly. And she's doing so by drawing a parallel between these American phenomena and the caste system in India, okay? Which is a pretty bold move, and it's proven to be somewhat controversial. So whether or not you think that Wilkerson succeeds, and I'm definitely not going to adjudicate that question, whether or not you think she succeeds depends a lot on whether you think it's more important to stress the irreducible particularity of the African American story or put it in relationship with other stories. So far, I would say that the reception of Wilkerson's book suggests the more you know about India, the less likely you are to find her approach legitimate. So, for example, the Indian-American anthropologist Arjun Appadurai writes, quote, Wilkerson's dramatic unearthing of caste under the surface of race in the US is just a literary device to tell a familiar American story in an unfamiliar way. It is not based on a genuine similarity, unquote. Okay, so he finds this act of comparison problematic to the point of near illegitimacy, right? And I'm teaching a comparative class, so things like that make me nervous. I'm probably more comfortable with the race caste comparison that is someone like Appadurai, and not only because I don't know a lot about India's caste system, but also because I tend to believe that in the end, there's no thinking that's not comparative thinking. So take, for example, the historian of Russia, Alessandro Stanziani. He works on unfree labor in different times and different places. And he was talking in a podcast recently about this, and he noted that his teacher, the famous historian Franco Venturi, always insisted on this point. So Venturi taught his students that our analyses are always unavoidably, implicitly comparative. We are always comparing. And for that reason, it behooves us to make our analyses explicitly comparative. That's the more intellectually honest path, Venturi said. So this is how I approach the side-by-side teaching of serfdom and slavery, which, to be honest, sometimes does strike me as problematic. To what extent are these institutions legitimately comparable? And, are we not just perpetuating a Cold War binary by doing that? Well, I've decided that even if the similarities between the two pale next to the differences, and despite the kind of, lingering Cold War vibe, the juxtaposition itself is pedagogically useful. In fact, very useful. In the end, I think it helps defamiliarize the perhaps, often heard horrors of American race-based slavery, often heard that is by American undergraduates, as well as the crazy speciousness of American racial categories. And to defamiliarize something is to open up the possibility of new insights, maybe even new freedoms. So this is what I say to students when I'm opening the class on serfdom and slavery. And this is actually from my teaching notes, just a sec. I tell them that we're not comparing in the sense of judging one thing against another. We're comparing in the sense of looking at one text or one tradition, and then looking at another text or another tradition, and seeing how our experience of one affects our experience of the other. That is, you're still going to consider each text on its own terms as a unique object, including as an aesthetic object, but you're going to allow your point of view, you're going to allow the questions that you ask of the text to be informed by what you've learned from the other text, from the other tradition. So I tell them that in reading, whether you're reading historical texts or literary texts, interpretations always grow out of the questions you ask, but also they grow out of the questions you don't ask. So putting in serfdom and slavery next to each other, the texts of serfdom and slavery next to each other, can help us think about the questions that we might not otherwise ask. So, and then I give them a couple of pretty basic examples, and we talk about them. So I say, okay, the text of American slavery, we can read it in the context of the history of racism against people of African descent, right, and exploitation of people of African descent. If we're reading in this context, what kinds of questions are we going to tend to ask? And they generate these questions, right? We'll ask questions about skin color, about the weird preoccupation with miscegenation. We'll talk about pseudoscience, middle passage, stuff like that. And I say, okay, so now what if we change the context? What if we read the text of American slavery in the context of other kinds of forced and exploited labor over time that don't have anything to do with our conceptions of race? So Greek and Roman slavery, prison labor, sharecropping in different times and places. Then what kinds of questions are we more likely to ask? And they answer with things like, maybe we talk about labor shortages, economics, war and captivity, diasporas, class power. Okay, so that's the first example I give of what comparison can do for us and how point of view leads us to ask certain questions. And then I give another example that's specifically Russian. And I talk to them, I give them the title of two well-known books about serfdom and forced labor in Russia. And I say, judging from the titles, what kinds of questions are these books going to ask? The first one is Jerome Blum's old book, Lord and Peasant in Russia. Lord and Peasant in Russia. I say, okay, what do you think the focus of this book is? How does it approach the experience of serfdom? What kind of questions does it ask? And they figure out that Blum is mostly describing serfs as they exist in their relationship to their masters. His emphasis is on the master's power over the serf's lives and on serf's resistance to this power, right? I say, okay, then what about this book by Stephen Hawke called Serfdom and Social Control? It's a little bit harder to judge from the title, but I explain to them that the focus of this book is the mechanisms of social control within the serf community. That is, how power was divided up in serf villages among the different serfs and how some exercised that power over others. And when you're reading this book, you can almost forget that the masters are there, right? Because it's not about the masters. So I explain that what I'm trying to do is not to say that these books contradict each other or cancel each other out, because of course they don't. They ask different questions, and as a result, they come up with different descriptions of serfdom as a phenomenon. And that's what I'm hoping that this course will do. We're trying to learn something about representations of serfdom and slavery that we wouldn't have learned by considering the two phenomena in isolation, right? So that's a sort of like long, somewhat paranoid introduction to this comparative course. Well, and why is it paranoid? It's paranoid basically because whenever you're comparing two things, you really need to do a lot of work to motivate the comparison and, make sure that you haven't just chosen these two random things that shouldn't be compared. So, okay, what exactly have I found to be useful for American students in the serfdom slavery pairing? Well, first of all, for many American undergraduates, it's revelatory, it's even shocking to hear that Russians enslaved or effectively enslaved by enserfing other Russians. That is, people who looked like them, were from the same places, shared the same history, and the same religion. So that this degree of oppression can exist without any racial difference, again, is news to many American students. Second, this pairing introduces American students to the facts of class domination and class identity in all of their destructive and deforming power. And I'm using class very loosely here because, of course, throughout most of 19th century Russian history, we don't use the word class to describe categories of people. But it's revelatory for my students to learn that Pushkin, for instance, took and was obliged to take his class identity as a nobleman very, very seriously, whereas he felt free at times to play a bit with his racial identity, deriving enjoyment from his nickname, Afrikanец, for example. And I hope it's liberating for my students to learn not just that Pushkin was proud of his Black heritage, which he obviously was, but that in Pushkin's time and place, the category of race had a different meaning. And it was less powerful in shaping his life and identity, I think, than were other categories like soslovia and confessia, right? So as Russia specialists know, but as American undergraduates typically don't know, what has long mattered the most in Russia, from imperial times to the Soviet era and up to today, is the power of entrenched social elites. And here I'm going to quote Nathaniel Knight, and I think that Nathaniel is actually speaking in the same series later this month. And this is his description of these Russian social elites. He says, because Russian elites were defined in contrast to the powerless masses, the elites could afford to be laterally inclusive, right? Meaning they could afford to incorporate, as he's going to explain, more ethnic groups. Just as the old imperial nobility could include Baltic German barons, Polish magnates and Szlachta, Kyrgyz khans and sultans, Tatar mirzas and beks, Georgian Tavada and Bessarabian boyars, so the Bolshevik elite could accommodate individuals with names like Kaganovich, Radosmysly Apfelbaum, that's Zinoviev, Rosenfeld, that's Kamenev, Dzerzhinsky, Mikoyan, Beria, and of course, Jugashvili, Stalin himself. So what Knight is explaining there is that when eliteness was defined by, quote, proximity to power and exclusivity of privileges, racial demarcation was a tool of lesser utility in constituting one's place in the hierarchy. So again, this is useful information, I think, to my students. That is the idea that power can be distributed along, and status and prestige can be distributed along such different lines than what they're used to, and that these ethnic/racial categories were not deployed in Russia or the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation in the same way. So then in class, we go through and we try to unpack various Russian words like narod, plemya, tribe, nationalnost, nationality, ethnicity, rasa, race, soslovia, caste, confessia, religion, and class, talking about how they've changed over time and how they map or do not map onto the kinds of labels that Americans are more familiar with. So to illustrate Russian systems of racial and ethnic classification, there are a lot of ways you can do this. What I've sometimes done is shown students this image or images like this, and I have to do my screen share again. And this is, these are images from from a book published in 1970, but you could get lots of different examples of this, called Антропологические типы населения СССР, right? The anthropological types of the Soviet Union. And it has drawings of literally dozens of types that could be used in classifying the population of the Soviet Union. And let me find it. Okay, you guys can see this, right? So here, I think that there's something, sorry.
Call from Orange Health Post.
Sorry. One second. Mom, here it is. Sorry, I'm at home. So we have dozens, I think it's like 160 or something, illustrations of different ethnic types, right? There's Mordvin, Chuvash, more Chuvash, we get subsets of Chuvash, and this goes on and on for pages and pages. And again, they're called, in this particular publication, they're called types. And different images like this circulate on the internet, and I decided to use this one because I know that this one is authentic and was published in a book by the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 1970. Okay, hang on. So what does it get American students to look at this? Well, it's kind of similar to what you can also get by explaining to them what the different ethnic categories were and are in Russian and Soviet censuses. Like, what are the opportunities for self-classification that people are given? Because those categories are very different from the ones offered by the US census. And what the goal is to think about not only what these various classification systems tell us about the Russian and Soviet empires, but what they tell us about the American one-drop rule, right? They become just another way of drawing attention to the imaginariness of America's black-white binary. And information like this helps students see that some of the terms we use in the West to discuss colonialism, empire, race, racialization are slightly off when applied to the Russian case. We still need this vocabulary of colonialism, empire, race, racialization, racism, because these phenomena exist in Russia in their own versions. But I think it's good for students to be exposed to historical particularities so that I can caution them against adopting Western critical vocabulary wholesale, applying it to all times and places. That said, I want to make it clear that I'm not at all comfortable with representations of Imperial Russia, the Soviet Union, or today's Russian Federation that minimize the everyday racism experienced by minorities, especially Black people. Nor do I believe that because Russia's system for racializing and classifying human beings has long been very different from ours, this difference means that racism, and especially anti-Blackness, are not Russian problems. So I hear kind of suggestions of that sometimes, and I really want to push back against that. So, you know, the blackface in, say, Nijinsky's Petrushka is still blackface. And the abuse that my Black students have faced in Russia still has its roots in specifically anti-Black racism. That the Russian Empire has always been multiracial doesn't change this hard fact. And I think it's important to acknowledge as much to our students. I would never claim to understand the origins of 20th and 21st century anti-Blackness in Russia, but to deny it or obscure it risks gaslighting our students of color, especially those who travel to the former Soviet Union. So I'm actually going to stop for a minute, and maybe Annie can reappear too and advise me on this. I want to ask how people would like to proceed, because at this point, you know, I haven't spoken for very long, but I'm happy to go straight to discussion and questions because it might be more useful. Or I can talk more about the serfdom slavery class, show you some of the pairings I tend to work with, the reading pairings. But if you want to move to questions, that's fine with me too. Rather than discussion, actually.
You want to, sorry, now my email is going to go wild while I'm trying to talk. So I am, I'm just looking to see, I don't see any immediate questions. I see a question from Eric. Maybe there's a way to sort of, I would love to also hear more, just in terms of your class, but I think maybe there's a way that we could kind of look at the questions and then simultaneously, talk about the class, weave that in. Okay. So this is first question, great talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the differences in the way that serfdom and slavery have existed in popular memory in Russia and the United States after abolition. Is this an issue you've addressed in the class?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. And yes, I mean, almost all of my class is devoted to representations of serfdom and slavery that were generated after abolition. So the class is like de facto about memory. And Amanda Brickell, I think I'm failing to get the whole name, but she has a new book about precisely this. Which analyzes not only a lot of text, but a lot of like paintings and, popular imagery and tchotchkes and things like that. So yeah, we talk about that a lot. And we talk about the changing ways that these things were memorialized or suppressed, non-memorialized in certain times and places. So yeah, class is really kind of de facto a class about memory. More than half of it is about cultural material that was generated after abolition in both places. Does that help, Eric?
We have another question. What strategies do you use in your teaching to demonstrate that race, both in the United States and in Russia, is a complex and multidimensional concept that cannot be reduced to a single definition or context? And Eric says, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, on the American side, what's interesting is to point out how very long ago African-American thinkers were making that point, right? So they make the point themselves. And the text that I'm reading, certainly, the text that I'm assigning are repeatedly making the point that race is a construct. And like there's a wonderful quote that says that if Pushkin tried to get on a street, this is from an African-American journalist, I think J.A. Rogers, writing in the 30s or the 20s, you can talk about, Pushkin and whether or not he's black, but I can tell you if he tried to get on a streetcar in the American South, they'd make him sit in the back. Right. So they're very clear about the fact that these categories are not applied universally across time and space. And I use Nathaniel Knight's work. I use the other like Marina Magilner's work on how race was constructed in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. And we read secondary sources, but it often comes out in the primary sources very clearly, how constructed race is as a category.
Thank you for your answer. Another question that has come up in the chat is, I would like, and this is more just a request, but I would like to hear more about specific literary texts that you might use in the class.
Sure. Well, since it is a class on serfdom and slavery, I feel obligated to cover some of the sort of big classics, right, on both sides. So not only do I do Turgenev, like Notes of a Hunter, but I also do the classic slave narratives, both those written by women and those written by men. So, I do Harriet Jacobs, Harriet Wilson, Frederick Douglass, and we talk about those texts and we sort of give them their due, right? And I don't always force them into comparative context when those texts themselves are so important. And then we sort of pull back later. When I want to be actively comparative, I try to pair things that were actually generated at around the same time. So one thing, for example, and these are pre-abolition texts that read very well together. I teach Tolstoy's short, unfinished, relatively short, unfinished povest, A Landowner's Mourning, which is about this kind of young landowner who can't understand his serfs and is trying to treat them right, but can't get anything right and doesn't understand anything about them, and they just resist his understanding. I teach that alongside Melville's very tricky novel, Benito Cereno, which is about a rebellion, slave rebellion on a ship, and how the slaves essentially trick, using the stereotypes that the white people already believe in. They work to sort of overcome the quote masters and free themselves in the ship. So I pair Uncle Tom's Cabin with talk about sentimentalism and the political power of the sentimental, specifically the political power that we now find kind of icky, right? Little Ava and her sweetness and her blue eyes. And I pair that often with Turgenev's Mumu, which is also kind of like icky, sentimental, sweet. And there are all kinds of funny Russian memes about Turgenev's Mumu. That's about a sad serf who has a puppy and he loves the puppy and he's mute, and then the mistress makes him drown the puppy. Very, very sad, like so sad that, you're kind of laughing because it's so sad. So put those things together and talk about what are the political, ideological uses of sentimentalism. Like, what does it get you when you're working to essentially humanize people who have been denied the status of full human subjects? What can sentimentalism do for you? So that's just kind of a start. I don't know if that helps.
The next question is, what was the name of the Russian man mentioned who speaks about free labor and who did a podcast?
Oh, he's Italian, Alessandro Stanziani. So he's Italian. He teaches at the École Supérieure, I think, in Paris. And his teacher was the famous Russian historian Franco Venturi. So Alessandro Stanziani, he did a podcast recently with Amanda Brickell, but that's her middle name. I'm blanking out on her last name, where they talked about their comparative work on serfdom and slavery.
Interesting. So we have another question, and that is, thank you for the great insights. I'm wondering if you address Russian imperialism and the Caucasus, either in literature or in history, in your discussion of race in Russia.
We do. I am mostly working on serfdom and non-race in this class. It's a comparison of the institutions, but of course you can't do it without talking about the fact of the empire, right? And not only the fact that both elites and non-elites were kind of multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, but also about conquering, really. And again, we don't read texts that are specifically about this because the class is about serfdom and slavery, not so much about race in Russia. But I tell them that famous, very, very problematic formula, Russia was, an empire that conquered itself, right? I'm sure there's someone here who can give me the Russian quotation in better form and ask, what does it mean to say that you conquered yourself, right? Does it mean that you're in an imperial relationship to your own people? Does it mean that these other ethnic groups and groups of people that you've conquered now become Russian because they become yourself? So we talk about the fact of the contiguous empire and the fact that a contiguous empire means that in the Russian case particularly, you're never as sure about who's yourself and who's the other, right? Because it's not like the British where they go over there to India and they conquer them, or the French who go over there to Egypt and conquer them, and they know who's the us and who's the them. And it's messier in the Russian case. Does that make sense? I wish I could see people. It would be better, but here.
Yeah. This is all very anonymous.
I know. It's so weird.
We're getting more, and Jenny Communer, who has the original question, says thank you.
Sure.
Another question. Again, thanks for a wonderful talk. This may not relate as closely to this class, but do you or anyone else that you know have any insights about how to teach the Tatar-Mongol yoke and its legacy in Russian culture?
Oh, that's such a good question. I bet there are people here who have more insights into that than I do. I mean, I'm interested in it as, as a myth, obviously. Like it can be used to explain everything. It's like swaddling, right? All you have to do is like mental the Mongol yoke and, you're off. So I actually don't teach that. I'm not a historian. But I would be really interested if anyone else here, I see Joan Newberger is here. Is there anyone else who's...
I could say something about it as a non-historian. As a non-historian, I have to. But no, I guess I teach it in my intro to Russian, and because this is a literary scholar that's asking. It's Emily Wang, so I was.
Oh, that was Emily. Hi.
The way that I teach it is my intro to Russian culture class, and I think it's part of sort of, weaving in some of the diversity that's there, and I personally focus very closely on how it's a non-yoke, that it is in fact just
exactly
a kind of, that they're not really, that it's not as violent, and that they're sort of these absentee figures. The Mongols are these absentee figures, and there's just a lot of freedom and opportunity for the sort of these Russian princes to develop and grow. And then I kind of tied into Alexander Nevsky. But I tend to focus more on on the ways in which it was actually more positive and productive.
Yeah. No, I think that's really wonderful. And then you get to ask the question, so given what you've just described, which is that it wasn't really that, constantly horrible or onerous, why is it the yoke? Why is it always going to be a yoke, right? And why is it invoked as an explanation for any problem that people want to identify?
And then I guess I'll just loop back to Emily, because she says, thank you so much. And she says, I wonder if there might be some miscegenation parallels in at least 20th century Russian literature to, for example, Bialy's Peterburg.
If there are parallels between what and that?
Some miscegenation parallel. Maybe am I mispronouncing?
On the American side?
Yes, in at least 20th century Russian literature.
So are there sort of fantasies or fears of miscegenation that appear in 20th century Russian literature?
I believe so, yes. And I think the example that Emily's giving is Peterburg.
In Bialy. Yeah. I mean, yes. Sorry, Emily, I just didn't get it. I think that definitely the answer is yes, and that there's always, and what's always fascinating is that, the intertwined desire and fear, right? Do we want to be wild Asiatics or Scythians or whatever, or do we not? We want to be go miscegenation. That's great. Or do we want to sort of draw this line? And I always end up talking a lot again about when you have a contiguous empire. It's kind of, you could argue that it's all miscegenation all the time, and I think that there's also not, if you compare it to the American side, there's not the degree of kind of obsession and horror with the badness of miscegenation, right? And sort of like not only in the case of Mongols, but just as the Russian Empire moves east and takes people over.
We have another question. Again, great talk, very interesting. The point that you mentioned about the Apodori, I studied Portuguese Indian identity through museum institutions, 19th and 20th century, and concerning the relation that you mentioned about the existence or non-existence of a relationship and race concepts between empires. You know, she would like to she would like to say that they exist directly linked to globalization since the 15th and 16th centuries, and wanted to hear your opinion of that.
So basically, the question is, to what degree is globalization responsible for racialization that happens around the world various times?
Yes.
I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but I would say that it's pretty clear that contact and globalization pushes people toward categorizing each other, right? And slotting people into racial categories. Beyond that, I don't, again, I mean, what's interesting to me is that there's always this tension between the particular and the general, right? And, is it helpful to say that this happens everywhere? Or is it more helpful to say this is the way it happened, in the Great Lakes region when the French missionaries met the native peoples, right? There's this like constant dance of particularity and generality in this, that sort of this material forces onto you.
Another question. Thank you for this great talk. I was wondering if and how women or the woman question came up in the class as another marginalized group.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. Well, for one thing, it comes up so clearly in the female slave narratives. So it's useful to start with them pretty early in the class and read texts like Harriet Wilson's Our Nig and Harriet Jacobs' story of her captivity. And what that does is like open up from the very beginning these questions so that they're present in the texts that are written by men as well. On the Russian side, it is difficult, almost impossible, to find texts that were actually written by women who were unfree. But there are lots of secondary texts that try to explain their positions. And I try to draw on those. And we end up talking a lot about how the woman question is represented as kind of overlapping with the peasant question in Turgenev, for example. But again, on the American side, it's those voices, because of the huge role that literacy and publishing played in the abolition movement, those voices are out there, and they're a lot harder to find on the Russian side for sure. To mostly get men talking about the women's question.
We have another, a follow-up question. This is Eric Scott. If I may, about memory. In particular, I was wondering if you had any observations about how the descendants of serfs and slaves view and experience the past of serfdom slavery in different ways. It seems that in the Russian case, former serfs and their descendants are seen as Russian, in some ways quintessentially so, and more so than non-Russian nationalities from the periphery, whereas the descendants of African-American slaves have continued to be marked as different and as other.
Yeah, I mean, that's a theme that runs through the whole class, really, is that one of the reasons I think that in some ways abolition happened the way that it did, or the emancipation happened the way it did in Russia, was because simultaneously, you could locate in this largely inserved peasantry, you could locate, the essence of Russianness, right? They're you, they're authentically you and related to you, you being a member of the elite. On the other hand, just because you were going to liberate them from serfdom did not mean that they were going to have political participation, right? And they were still going to be peasants. They maybe weren't going to be serfs, but they were going to be peasants, and they were still going to be Russian. And then there are these sort of decades of thinking about how and to what degree they're going to be integrated into political life, right? You fight about that all the way up until the revolution. And obviously it happens very differently in the US because except for a very brief period during Reconstruction, Black people are just excluded from the political process. And it's easy to exclude them because they can be physically identified. And that's, there's no question that they have to really fight, obviously, to be recognized as Americans. That's still going on now. I mean, that's what birtherism is, right? So yeah, we talk about that a lot. That kind of stretches all the way through the class. Does that help, Eric? Please ask a follow-up if that's.
I don't see anything from Eric yet, but we'll come back to him if we see more on the chat. Another question. Thank you for this talk. Could you? Sorry, I don't want to skip anyone. Could you speak about your pedagogical strategies that teach about institutions comparatively without minimizing the particularities of generational impacts of chattel slavery, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness in the U.S.? This is
what I worry about. Yeah, this is what I really worry about. And that's why, I sort of like torture myself every time I'm going to teach this class, which is, are these things legitimately comparable, and how can I not make that mistake that you're pointing out? And I can say that of the weeks of the class, quite a number of them are not comparative. And when there are, particularly when we have African American texts or historical moments that really demand a kind of the kind of focus that I think we couldn't do if we were looking at them comparatively, that's what we do. Frederick Douglass gets a week, Harry Jacobs gets a week, and we're not like constantly leaning on the comparison. And then every once in a while, sort of like zoom out and think about them comparatively. And the students do that organically. That's actually quite. They do that. But that, I don't know who asked that question, but that's exactly what I worry about in this class. On the other hand, if we never compared anything, then we have nothing but irreducible particularity. But yeah, thank you for that question. Does that answer it?
And I think I didn't finish reading it entirely, but I think the author said that this is not to suggest that, and this is Chelsea West Ahueri, this is not to suggest that comparison is not generative. I teach comparatively too, but rather, especially in this current moment, how you emphasize the role of white supremacy and its global structure, including how it operates in Russia, which.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And it's particularly important now, well, first of all, because of our historical moment in the US and Black Lives Matter, and what the kind of coming to consciousness that I hope a lot of people are experiencing, that's really important. But it's also important because I think that there is this tendency to kind of give Russia a pass when it comes to race and racism, because, Soviet internationals or, things work differently over there. So, we're not going to talk about anti-Blackness. And I think that that's also problematic. And I think that, centering anti-Blackness specifically can sometimes be useful. I would like to talk about this more too, because I really do think I could talk ad nauseum about how differently race, nationalist, whatever, was understood in Russia. But But that doesn't mean that there wasn't and that there isn't anti-Blackness specifically, which is very painful and awful. But I feel like, and this is partly, I think this because of talking with my Black students about the experiences they've had in the former Soviet Union, not to talk about anti-Blackness is really a form of gaslighting. So, you know, highlighted on the American side, it's so absolutely central. Don't ignore it on the Russian side either.
And you know, Chelsea says thank you and that she would love to talk to you more about this.
Great.
The next question is, do you bring in indentured servitude into the discussion? In New Orleans, Irish and Germans were said to have been used to clear the swamps and not Black slaves because slaves were property and therefore of greater value.
We definitely, and Peter Kolchin talks about this quite a lot in his seminal book from the 80s about comparing serfdom and slavery. Yeah, we talk about the relationship between indentured servitude and slavery and how the categories were somewhat blurred in the 17th century, and then by around 1700 they were significantly less blurred and it came to be about race. I talk about that. I also talk about this like crazy specious kind of internet fake history that I do get from my students sometimes, which is, well, you know, the Irish were slaves too, right? So we talk about that, and we talk about indentured servitude, and we talk about different forms of unfree labor, while also making the distinction between that and race-based chattel slavery. I get a lot of, every once in a while, not a lot, but every once in a while, I'll get a student who's really insisting that it's sort of a white lives matter thing, actually. You know, Irish were slaves too, whatever that means.
Another question. Thank you for this talk. Do you happen to discuss Russian imperial inferiority complex in your class, the view of Russia as a second-rate empire in comparison to Britain and France and Russian history and catching up with Western European empires?
I mean, I love that stuff.
And whether this inferiority complex shapes the concept of whiteness versus non-whiteness in Russia.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I love that stuff. I love the Russian imperial inferiority / superiority conflict. Tension that informs so many 19th century texts. If we think, for example, about Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech of 1881 that he gave right before he died, that's all about how, Russia / the Russian Empire / the Russian soul is going to absorb all the other souls into it, right? Because it's like so big and so special and so multi-everything. But in the end, it's all about making Europe recognize Russia as a real empire, right? So that tension runs through almost everything we do. And a lot of the book I published this year, or I guess at the end of last year, is really about that. It's really about that sort of inferiority complex that gets expressed in the Russian tradition as a preoccupation with being provincial, right? With being second rate, with being a kind of copycat European country. Does that answer the question?
I think so. A lot of people have been, replying and saying thank you after you answer. So another one, and we're kind of nearing our 5 o'clock, so we'll take a couple more of these. I'd like to ask you about the Russians and their comprehension about racism. My Russian young friends compare Russian serfdom with Afro-American modern slavery. For them, it was the same phenomenon. What do you think about this tendency of not considering race as crucial to define modern slavery? Could this missing point be identified as miscomprehension about the role of racialization in modern slavery, as they tend to compare any situation of oppression with slavery?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that is both useful and dangerous about the comparison itself is that, you don't want to, you want to talk about forms of bondage and unfree labor over time. And you want to point out the fact that they were not always race-based, right? There are forms of bondage and unfree labor and exploitation that have nothing to do with race. However, the one that shaped American history was thoroughly about race. And so even if we're asking questions of American slavery that arise from the comparison with serfdom, I never want to be minimizing the role of race in those questions.
And I think, that's basically all the questions, which gets us very close to 5 o'clock. And so I think I want to take a moment to thank our speaker for doing such a wonderful job, sharing her comments, but also taking so much time to address all of these questions that came up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, it's really rich material and in some ways kind of like scary material to teach. So, I welcome feedback, ideas to those of you who are historians. Sorry, I'm not one. I really mostly teach literary texts, and I didn't have a chance to talk very much about that. But that's really the class is a lot about reading and representation and figuring out how things get represented. So thank you so much. Thank you, Annie, especially.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for coming.
Okay, I'm going to check out. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.